After the game is before the game. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to today's BWO-Expertise seminar of the tender for areas that have not been centrally pre-investigated. My name is Stefan Timm. I am the Managing Director of the BWO, the Bundesverband Windenergie Offshore, or translated in English, Federal Association of Offshore Wind Energy in Germany. The quote after the game is before the game is that Herberger's quote. It's often repeated in these days of the European Soccer Championship. And this quote is now 60 years old. Regardless of age, it applies in two ways to our current situation. The first round of tenders is just over, and at the same time, the stakeholders are already looking ahead to the next offshore tender. And it's not much different from the BWO's situation. It feels as if we have just talked about the tender design, and as many of you know, we did. A few weeks ago, we spoke with Dr. Christine Bader from Watson, Farley and Williams about the rules in this auction. And now we are looking on the results. The fact you are here, our audience, shows me it's still not boring. Initially, we had planned to hold this online seminar in German, but the interest from abroad has moved us to conduct it in English. After record proceeds in the tenders last year already attracted international attention, once more, the tender results in Germany have attracted a great deal of attention, not only in Germany. More than 350 participants have registered for today's online seminar. And let me tell you, I'm quite proud because this is a new record for BWO. I am pleased to have Dominik Hübler as a speaker and discussion partner here with me. As many of you know, Dominik is a director at the consulting company NERA for the energy industry. And he is well known as an energy expert and expert in the field of auction design. Today, we start with a lecture of Dominik. In the second part, he will answer some questions, the questions from the audience. And this brings me to an important point. Please write down your questions, preferably in English, in our chat. Our editorial team will cluster your questions and we will process them together with NERA. The Q&A session this time can be a little bit longer and detailed than our other BWO expertise seminars. We have scheduled 90 minutes in time. Dominik, let me help you. First, I want to welcome you again, but let me help you with the first question. You have to deny it, because as an expert, you must not be surprised by the result of the auction, are you?
Well, I mean, at Zukunft Offshore, I allowed myself the bold prediction that the results this time around would be somewhere between the August and the June results from last year. Arguably, that wasn't the most daring prediction to make, given that that gave me nearly 800 million euros of wiggle room. So I'm glad to say I was not surprised that this has proven right. But thankfully, there were some interesting things below the surface that were very interesting and that we might have thought about theoretical possibilities, but to see them play out the way they did was at least a mild surprise. And I'm very happy to take you through some of the things that we learnt from this auction. Some of the things that you may be able to take into the August auctions, and some of the things that we as an entire industry should be thinking about beyond the August auctions. So hopefully I can now move the presentation. Yeah, all right. So just very briefly about myself. I think I've met many of the people who are online today before. Stefan's already said, at NERA, we do a lot of work on offshore wind auctions, both in assisting bidders and in helping auctioneers design the auction schemes to make sure that they don't end up with any nasty surprises. On top of the auctions-based work, we do consulting work on business case design, transactions. We also help people when things go wrong as economic experts in disputes, whether they be of a commercial or an investor state nature, and generally look at various economic facets of the offshore wind sector. And I'll try and bring some of these experiences to bear when I look at the auction results that for this year's June auction that the BNetzA published last Friday. So first thing I've done is to look at how they compare to the results from the 2023 auction. What you see here is some familiar names. TotalEnergies was a winner in 2023, and they won another site. The second winner this time round is a new kid on the block as far as these latest auctions are concerned, but certainly not an unfamiliar name in German offshore wind. EnBW is back to the list of developers with exciting new sites to develop. They were by no means the only people interested in this auction. If you look to the very last column here, this time round, we had 7 bidders for the one site and 9 bidders for the other, which is very much in line with what we had in the 2023 auctions. As I already mentioned, the bid components that were offered were a bit below what we saw in the 2023 auctions, or the 2023 June auctions, I should say, and probably more in line with what we saw on the competitive sites for the August auctions. The number of auction rounds is the final piece of information here. And that was the one that was probably the bit that was somewhat unexpected. Because what you see here when you look at the red boxes, for one of the sites, you have the same number of rounds that you had for one of the sites in 2023, but there's a 50% difference in the bid value. So I'll spend a bit of time working to figure out what happened there and what made this auction rather long, at least in terms of rounds. Some of you will recall a webinar I had with BWO about 1.5 years ago, when I looked at the poor civil servant running the auction who might have their holidays ruined because it would take 2 weeks. I'm glad to report that we managed to squeeze these 55 rounds into less than a week this time round, and it's before holiday season in most German states anyway, so there's a good bit of German efficiency there. But let's dig deeper into what happened. Why did it take so many rounds this time to arrive at a much lower bid value? And why does the lower bid value correspond to the higher number of rounds? And to get to the bottom of what happened there, we need to take a quick look at the auction rules. And the question of what looked like a fairly innocuous change, and apologies if you don't read German, I'll try and sort of explain very briefly what happened. In 2023, the bid increment for each round was 30,000 euros per megawatt, unless a bidder dropped out in the previous round, when the bid increment would drop to 15,000. If in the subsequent round nobody would drop off, the increment once again went back up to 30,000. And it would go on like this until there is only one last bidder standing. For the 2024 auctions, the rules changed somewhat. If out of the initial 9 on the one site that we saw, one drops out, that had no impact on the bid increment. It would stay at 30,000. But once you're down to one-on-one, I think I called it the heavyweight combat in my LinkedIn post on this, the bid increment would stay at 15,000 for any subsequent round. So essentially what this meant was that if you're dropping to two bidders relatively early on, it would actually look more like a middleweight boxing fight, where the blows may not be quite as hard as in a heavyweight boxing fight, but they can go on for a long time. And that's exactly what we saw on one of the sites here. To get to just exactly how many rounds of each there were, let me include some advanced maths. And no worries if that scares you. We've got an illustration of it using boxing gloves, so pick whichever one you prefer. Essentially what we've got here, based on the information BNetzA has published so far, is two unknowns with two equations. We know the number of rounds that each site took. So in the case of the site that EMBW won, the one I highlighted at the start, that was 55 rounds. And this total number of rounds needs to be made up of what I've labeled A here, which is rounds with more than two bidders, the ones where you've got the heavy 30,000 euro blows. And then it's B, the middleweight fight, where it's down to 15,000. And the second equation that we can use here is we know what the final bid value was, 1.065 billion. And we know that for each of the A rounds, the addition was 30 million, and for each of the B rounds, the addition was 15 million. Just to mix things up a bit, I've added the numbers for the site that Total won. So it's 46 is the total number of rounds, 1305 million is the sum of A multiplied by 30 and B multiplied by 15. You can plug the first equation into the second. You can play around with these a bit, and you find that at the end, out of the 46 rounds on this Total site, there were 41 rounds where there were more than two bidders. And then, now I wouldn't dare call that advanced maths, there were 5 rounds left where there were only 2. As I mentioned, enough heavy maths for the day. We shall look at what happened on the other side with some boxing gloves. There's 9 boxing gloves and 7 boxing gloves representing the bidders. Early morning on Monday the 17th, everybody up bright and early, the clock's at 0. As I mentioned, BNetzA had given itself a bit of a more ambitious schedule for running the rounds. So what we got here, and it's maybe a bit small, is from the BNetzA publication. We've run through an exhausting day, 13 rounds of bidding. We're up to 390 million euros per gigawatt on both sites. Both sites have at least 3 bidders still standing. The ones in light green, we don't have the information on yet. We may well have seen the first few people drop out. I mean, after all, 390 million per gigawatt is around where the final Dutch auction that ended only a few weeks ago cleared. I'll come back to why the Dutch auction may not be a great guide to what you had to expect in Germany, but the point here is that the light green ones we don't have the information on yet. We may get there eventually. For the moment, all we know is one day's been gone. There are at least 3 bidders on both sites. We're going to see another full day of bidding. It turns out not. It's pretty much just after breakfast time on the second day. And on N12-3, 480 million in, so just over what was paid in the Netherlands, we're down to 2. Are we seeing a big sort of quick resolution here, massive drop in prices? It could be. Or we end up going till the end of the day with no more known casualties. Again, some of the light blue ones may have dropped out, and light green ones on top may have dropped out. The other interesting thing that you can see here at the end of Tuesday the 18th is how the values on the clock have diverged. we're up to 780 million per gigawatt, which is broadly the average value that was bid in the August auction last year. On N11.2, there are at least 3 bidders standing. There may be more. On N12.3, we've settled into the middleweight bout. There are only 2 going. They keep going hard, but at a slower pace. 630 million per gigawatt for N12.3. We going to go another full day, or are we going to see some things happening? Turns out not a whole lot happened on the Wednesday. So this is the day Germany's second European Cup match. The folks that are bidding on the 11.2 site might have needed an extra beer, given that they're now almost 300 million per gigawatt ahead of what's happening on the N12.3 site. Both still going strong. Moving into Thursday. And finally, the third last bidder on 11.2 drops. We're now closing in on a 400 million gap between the two. The third, and just remember, the third strongest bidder dropped out to 1230 million per gigawatt. So we're into essentially middleweight territory on both of these. Are we going to see a resolution on the 20th? Turns out we do. On the one that, because of the long hours of 30,000 euro steps, was well ahead of the other. We see a resolution only 5 rounds after the third last had dropped out. I'd spoiled that before, but here goes. Total and RWE put on the crown halfway through the Thursday. The second strongest bidder on that site dropped out at 1.3 billion gigawatts. Is that the sign of the times for those guys on N12.3 to throw in the towel? Or do we go on for days and days until they also make it to 1305? Turns out we go on till the end of this day at least. 2 still going, but then we're at 1020, still some way below where the second and third last bidder on the previous site dropped out. We're going to see the entire Friday? Turns out we don't. Shortly after breakfast, once again, the third round of the day seems to be a good one for some news. We've got resolution on N12.3. EnBW is crowned the winner of the N12.3 site at a value that is materially below the N11.2 site. In fact, that is materially below what the second and third strongest bidder on the 11.2 site would have been willing to pay. Is that a sign that Germany's auction design is inefficient? Now, these sites are not like for like exactly. One of them is a 1.5 gigawatt site. One of them is a 1 gigawatt site. There are some differences in full load hours, but it seems a pretty large difference. And one of the reasons that it could come to this very large difference is because the German auction design does not allow switching between sides. Once the third guy on N11.2 had made once N12.3 was down to 2 bidders only, there was no way for whoever else was bidding on 11.2 to move to N12.3 while seeing that valuations on N12.3 were lower. When we worked with bidders as part of the 2023 auctions, we highlighted that this could happen. We didn't see much of it happening in 2023, but it is a very interesting and quite sort of unique result, almost, that it happens here and that sort of valuation falls apart by quite this much. So I think that's something that we need to take away when we think about how we want to go ahead. Obviously, one point here is this may have been the last time that we've seen several dynamic auctions being run largely in parallel. Based on the current area development plan, what we have in 2026 is a single site. So there's not going to be a whole lot of switching anyway. But we see the Dutch government thinking about, should we reduce the size of the sites? So if we end up seeing a similar trend in Germany eventually, we may very well end up with more dynamic bidding across several sites. And then that's a very important lesson to take away. So next, we should look what the stock market made of all of this. And what I've brought here is essentially 4 people who were very likely involved in the bidding. We've got a very sort of hard to read line from where I am, sort of halfway through the day, which is around when the auctions must have been announced. And then we see the Runaway Bride initially going up and then later on marginally going down. But as I've got at the top, we're talking about 0.18%. So this may well be noise, this may well be something else. In the end, the stock market clearly did not react very much to the news of RWE initially winning, or initially being announced a winner, and then drawing on the clause it had with TotalEnergies to leave after the announcement of the results. So where does that leave the groom that was left in the rain? Well, apparently, the groom did not have such a bad day on the stock market. TotalEnergies, again, saw a relatively small move, sort of some way after the announcement of the auction. It's up by 0.26%. Just to put this into perspective, 0.26% given Total's market cap is an increase in 400 million in valuation. So it's a small percentage number. It's quite a lot of value. Again, we can't be totally sure whether this is generated by the news that they won an auction at the price they did, but certainly the stock market did not seem to think that it was terrible news that Total won an auction at a bid price for 1.3 billion. So now let's take a quick look at some of the players who were probably involved as well and happen to be stock market listed. So I'm not picking on anyone, it's just the ones that have liquid trading. We have some that are down, we have some that are up. So essentially, I think what we can take from that is the results did not necessarily surprise the stock market in any material way. There's no major movement that suggests the stock market was super enthusiastic that someone won or that someone did not enter a bidding war. But rather this was sort of broadly in line with expectations. Let's take a look beyond Germany. And there's a lot of text on here. I'll not cover everything, but I'll try and give a flavor of some of the auction results that we've seen emerge throughout this year. And the point here is it's incredibly difficult to compare these on a proper like-for-like basis. In Norway, it was the first auction in Norway, is the fixed bottom 1.5 gigawatt site. The winner got a two-way CFD. The winner in this case was Parkwind and Inca, the investment vehicle for the IKEA family. They won their two-way CFD at a price that translates to roughly 10 cents per kilowatt hour. They need to pay the grid connection from that price. So take off a bit of money for the grid connection, but it does suggest that there isn't a huge amount of implicit lease fee paid into that. And then we have two fixed bottom auctions where the competition was exactly to pay lease fees. I'll start with the Dutch one because I've mentioned it before, and it closed about a week before, or the results were announced about a week before the German results. We again had winners that came from the utility plus a financial investor spectrum. We had limited interest from the oil and gas majors in those auctions. The winners were Vattenfall and CIP for the one site, and SSE and APG, which is a Dutch pension fund, on the other side. these guys paid significantly smaller lease fees than what's being offered in Germany. I mentioned one of them was at 400 million euros per gigawatt. The other one was 10 million per gigawatt. But as I mentioned, they're not completely comparable because the Dutch auctions require you to build a whole lot of additional expensive kit to add within the business case calculation, whether that's artificial reefs, whether that's an offshore floating solar, whether that's hydrogen infrastructure. So I think these always represented a lower bound for what would happen in Germany because of the baggage that came with it. And then, interestingly, we had another auction that closed during the same week. It was one in Estonia. Well, if we can speak of an auction there was one bidder. It put in the baseline bid, and it won a roughly 1 gigawatt site at 2.5 million euros. So why on earth is Estonian seabed worth a 500th of German seabed? And the answer is very simple. Estonian seabed is not fundamentally scarce. There have been various offshore wind site auctions in Estonia, and there's going to be another one a month down the line. So we're going to have sites of like 4 gigawatts plus to supply a country that's half the population of Berlin. As in, the demand needs to come from somewhere else. There's a whole lot of uncertainty, and essentially getting a site in Estonia, there is no immediate business case. It's sort of one step in a long chain of things that you need to do. While in Germany is clearly a limited number of sites. I mean, we're going to have a debate as part of the area development plan about just how scarce seabed is and what we're doing to the business case of German offshore wind by using the scarce space in the way that we do. So that is a fundamental difference in why it's quite hard to compare Estonian seabed to German seabed. And then I had hoped that I'd be able to put on the British A6 auction here as well, AR6 auction. Turns out that's delayed because there've been appeals against the process. So I put on a fourth here, but it's a bit of a very different beast in that it's a floating offshore wind auction. We had these auction results released in May 2024. There's a two-way CFD at about 85 euros per megawatt hour. Now, some of you may say, hold on, how is a floating offshore wind farm asking for a lower and I think there is an element of this hold on and some sort of pretty optimistic assumptions going into that based on what the French regulator published people had in their dossiers. But in defense of the people that bid there are various sort of risk mitigating factors in France. And for example, the grid connection is not part of the CFD. The grid connection is being paid for by the French transmission network operator, which is RTE. Of course, at the time, nobody could know that there's now a party leading in the polls in an election that nobody expected to happen, that essentially reckons all offshore wind should be scrapped. Let's hope that that doesn't catch on, but that's a sort of additional piece that clearly wasn't factored into the French prices. So just wrapping up on the sweep of what we've seen elsewhere, Germany remains a destination with a lot of interest, and I think there's one thing I hadn't mentioned. None of these other auctions had anywhere near the number of bidders that the German one had. Actually, the French floating one came closest. All the others were two-horse races from the start. Another reason Germany is fundamentally attractive is that, unlike in Estonia, you have a lot of demand, you have industry that needs and wants to decarbonize, and that means you have very good offtake options. You also have a payment schedule that is very friendly in the sense that is relatively heavily backloaded. in that a lot of your payments are being made while the wind farm is operational. And we did look at this as part of work that we did with the BWO in 2022, where we said this can be helpful in reducing the financing costs. But I think in light of where we are today, we need to take another look at the temporal allocation of payments under the German system, because this sort of heavily backloaded system not only has its advantages, the most important advantage here being the financing cost it saves and the sort of lower MPV, it also creates uncertainty, because essentially it potentially creates the option to terminate a project and writing off the requirement to pay these 90%. And I've spoken to some lawyers who reckon that you can probably get the 10% back as well if you haven't actually created an impact on sort of marine life. I'll not wade into the legal debate, but I mean, on the 90%, I understand there's a relatively good chance of recovery. So that creates uncertainty. It creates pressure to bid in the auction in a way that factors this in. So whether you like this optionality or not, the auctions that we have almost require you to take it into account. The fact that there is this uncertainty means there is a risk. Are we going to achieve the targets? Or does a fundamental negative change in the macroeconomic environment lead to some of these large scale projects being cancelled, this option being called? It creates uncertainty for the supply chain, because if I'm asking my supply chain, go build a turbine factory, I'll order for a 2 gigawatt park, and they know you have an option to build a 2 gigawatt park, it makes the discussion with their investment committee or their board a whole lot harder. It obviously creates issues for bidders who, if they have to cancel, lose the investment that they've made and lose the perspective they've made, lose the outlook, the pipeline that they have. And it also creates a problem for the intended recipients of the bit component. I mean, at the moment, we're talking about the German government made 13 billion out of last year's auctions. Well, they got a conditional promise to get 13 billion to reduce grid costs. It's not like a pool of cash that's already been shipped to the BMWK. As I mentioned, no one allocation is clearly better than the other, and both have their advantages and disadvantages. But I think this is one point that we need to think about as all the stakeholders in this discussion. To what extent is it this optionality that is driving German prices? And to what extent should there be somewhat lower bid values, but paired with an even better realization probability? There are clearly other things that we can do to improve the probability of projects being realized. One that I'm sure everybody's heard of is invest in the supply chain infrastructure, invest in ports, use some of all that money that's being conditionally pledged to be paid, or some of that has already been paid as part of the last auction, for a true transformation component that doesn't just transform the headaches of the budget committee in Parliament, but that also sort of directly flows into infrastructure in an orderly manner. And I mean, maybe what we also need is that we need the auctioneer to think about putting in place a mechanism that provides a clear path to potentially re-auctioning the sites at the least possible delay should something go wrong. The idea is, of course, not that something would go wrong. I mean, what we've seen is continued strong interest. We've seen stock markets believing in these projects. So I mean, everybody's going to agree that the number one best scenario is all these projects work, and then there's a lot of money being generated for the German grid customers. But given what we've seen in New York, where the regulator had to essentially make up these re-auction schemes on the fly to keep these projects moving, there are probably some advantages to putting such a mechanism in place. And we've done a bit of thinking with think tank Agora Energiewende about what this might look like. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that in a few weeks' time. With that, I have come to the end of my presentation. I'll take a very short drink, and then I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dominik. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Manuel Battaglia, and I'm the Energy Policies Lead here at BWO. My task today is to put you the questions which we receive from the audience. Speaking of which, I would like to encourage the audience to bring more questions because, frankly speaking, not so many questions have arrived yet. But of course, we are prepared for this situation. Now, since you were giving some policy recommendations on the last slide of your presentation, I would like to follow up on these policy recommendations because there is one question coming from our audience, and it's straight to the point, and it's coming from Johannes Schiel from Vestas, who is putting the question, should negative bidding be fully stopped in Germany or rationally kept? So I would rephrase it a little bit because this discussion is ongoing for 2 years now in our association and in the whole industry. So I would rephrase it as follows. Does this tendering round offer new arguments to stop the negative bidding process, such as introduced by the German law?
Thank you very much for a question at the heart of this debate. And I think let me sort of take one step back and approach the question of what should auction design do? One analogy to use there is if you go to a car shop, or in Berlin, maybe a sort of bike shop, and you ask for, now please have the fastest, most sustainable, cheapest, and most comfortable bike, and the guy comes and brings you one bike, he's lying. Because they can't all be the same. He should be bringing you 4 bikes. And to an extent, that sort of makes the same point with what you want to do with auction design. Auction design is a tool to achieve an end. And you can have different ends that you want to achieve. And many in this call were at Zukunft Offshore, and they heard Mr. Kruse from the FDP on the panel saying, what I want from an offshore design is I want offshore wind to pay for the grid connection, and I want it to pay for as much of the grid connection as possible. If that's your aim, then this is a fantastic system because it creates a lot of money that is conditionally pledged to reducing the grid cost. And if the project fails, there's no grid connection. So offshore wind paid for all the grid connection that is not created, and more potentially if some of the first 10% come. However, the question is that the only aim that auction design and offshore wind policy should pursue? I mean, we have given ourselves targets for renewable energy. We've got an Offshore Wind Act that says we want to achieve certain gigawatts by certain dates. We have commitments to reduce CO2. For all of that, we need to ensure that these projects aren't just being auctioned. These projects are being built. And there's this wonderful video floating through the internet. This is not a wind farm. And lots of things are not a wind farm until the wind farm's in the ground and producing power. And I think that very much comes back to this point that I made earlier. The way we have set up the current system with a largely uncapped bid component and a lot of this bid component being paid late is almost maximum problematic for the ability to deliver wind farm. Now, I think the next question becomes, what are some of the alternatives? And for a long time, I think a lot of us have looked to the Netherlands as a sort of key example of a different way of doing things, asking people to innovate, capping the bid component overall. What we've seen this time round, and maybe that is another point to bear in mind when we talk about auction design, is preparing for a Dutch auction is a very time-consuming and costly matter. So if there are 10 people bidding in a Dutch auction, there's a lot of preparation going down the drain because only one can win. And maybe that is one of the reasons why there were only 2 bidders per site that eventually submitted an offer. And I think that's something that we need to that we need to consider when we review sort of how we want to evolve auction design. I think that the core question, one that sort of too rarely made explicit, is what is it that auction design wants to achieve? And then you can come to different answers. I mean, sometimes you may come to the answer that the design that you have is not consistent with your stated goal. In that case, you should change the design. If you come to the conclusion that the politicians have a different goal to what you have, you need to go and convince the politicians that they should change the goal. Or, I mean, you may want to change the politicians that run the show. Germany gets the option to do that next year.
Thank you, Dominik. Let's come to the next question. I want to bring up a question from the German Association of Local Public Utilities of Municipally Determined Infrastructure Undertakings and Economic Enterprises, the VKU in German. And he's asking, Simon Koch is asking, thank you for the question, what are the potential effects of aggregating surcharges to a small number of companies, especially with regard to manufacturers, the potential price level of PPAs, and the risk of default?
Right, let me try and take these in turn. So first question is, to what extent have we aggregated the sites within a small number of bidders? I mean, it looks like it when we just have the June auctions. Essentially, we have 3 bidders owning all these sites. We obviously had a very different set of winners in the August auctions last time around. If we look at the auctions that I mentioned earlier, be it Norway or the Netherlands, we had yet more bidders that won sites. So I think across Europe, we currently have a very wide set of successful bidders. And the urgency with which we need to discuss the variety of bidders in the German system, I think, depends a bit on what we see in August. Because obviously, if we end up in a situation where where 1 or 2 or maybe 3 bidders have a lot of the leverage in these sites, it creates a risk in the sense that if one of these bidders decides to walk away, that affects a lot of sites. I think we then need to look at, are they walking away because they're reprioritizing what they do? Or are they walking away because the sites are fundamentally undevelopable at the bid values that they've offered? I think the first one, are people walking away because they have chosen to focus elsewhere? There's a bit of an example that the Norfolk Boreas in the UK, Vattenfall decided that wasn't for them anymore, but RWE thought it was a fundamentally developable site. So to that extent, I think is a market transaction. People are happy to snap it up. If these sites have become fundamentally unviable because the bid components are too high in the then macro environment, then we come to a point where that bidder has material leverage vis-a-vis the government. It's a bit of the New York State situation. It's like, we're going to walk away. Can you redo the auction? And we just win it, but at more favorable conditions. So that's a real risk. That risk may well be there if you have several bidders owning sites and all walking away in unison. I mean, New York wasn't one where there was too much concentration. It was one where the sites were fundamentally unviable for anyone. But in any case, this risk that sites may become fundamentally unviable goes back to this point I made before, that it is important to have this re-auction scheme and to think about what you want in this re-auction scheme. Should the bidder who handed back all these auctions be allowed back into this auction? I mean, they'd have a massive informational advantage, and essentially it'd almost be the same as the sort of going back to the government and saying, can I renegotiate one-on-one? The presentation recently by the Finnish government that said, we will have such a re-auction mechanism, and we will exclude the bidder who returns the site from this re-auction. There's a question for the lawyers on the line on whether you can do that with sites that have been auctioned, but it's certainly something that you could do with sites that will be auctioned next year. So I think that's a key part there. Then you've got the question of what does the dealing with site owners do to the supply chain? I mean, yes, it strengthens the position of that operator, but again, the supply chain is working across Europe. And my understanding is that at the moment, even the large wind farm operators are finding it hard to deal with the supply chain, which has its options elsewhere. So I think at the moment, based on where we are, the level of concentration that we've reached to date is probably not a huge concern. Obviously, different countries are looking at this in different ways. In the planned lease auction in the UK, we're going to have caps on how many sites an individual player can win. In the Finnish announcement, we had an announcement that there'd be a cap on the number of sites you can bid in per auction round, and there'd be a cap on the number of sites in Finland that you can operate. So there are different ways there, and they have advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, the more you cap the number of sites an individual bidder can compete for, the more you reduce competition. But at the same time, you limit these risks of these aggregation risks. Sorry, there's a very long answer.
Thank you, Dominik, for elaborating on this issue. I would now like to focus on the issue of tendering design, because we've received quite a couple of questions from our chat here. And I would like to begin with the following questions coming from Elmar Friedrich from Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. He's asking, and you raised this issue in your presentation a bit, but I think we should elaborate on this a little bit. How would a dynamic bid where bidders can change between sites impact auction dynamics and prices? What I understood from your presentation that you are a supporter of the system and you are recommending it, but if you could elaborate a little bit more on the effects of this system.
So essentially what you've got when you're allowed to switch between sites is you're going to see less of this sort of running apart of prices for different sites, because essentially what you would expect is that the prices for all sites rise in unison until bidding stops on the less attractive of the sites, because it may be that sort of both sites have reached 1 billion per gigawatt, but that fundamentally N11-12 was a more valuable site. So what we would expect in that context is that at some point people might be willing to raise their bid on the N11-2 site, but that they would stop bidding at the N12-3 site. And then if there's only one remaining bidder that's willing to go for the final bid step, that'd be the one who's winning. And then you'd be allowed to keep going on the N11-2 site until you've reached the sort of the cap there where there are no more bidders willing to pay. What it does is it removes what we call artificial demand. And artificial demand here refers to, under the German system, and it was especially acute in 2023, you had to bid for all 4 sites to stay in the game, even if you never had an intention to never ever develop 7 gigawatts of offshore wind. So it looked like there was huge amounts of demand for a long time. While under a sort of switching system, what you would do is essentially you would pay an entry fee to buy credits for either 1.5 gigawatts, or bidding credits for 1.5 gigawatts or 2.5 gigawatts. And that's sort of the number of bids per round that you're allowed to give. And only if you no longer bid on any of the sites will you then be removed.
Thank you, Dominik. I will keep with the questions on the market design. Perhaps one question more. And we have a question here stemming from Monika Morawiecka. I cannot say on behalf of which company she's raising the question, but anyway, she's asking, how do you see the process of introducing two-way CFDs in Germany as required by the energy market design reform?
Right. First, I'll defer to lawyers I've spoken to. I mean, my understanding is that you need to have two-way CFDs if you're supporting a wind farm. Here, what we're doing is we're asking these guys to pay a lease fee. So I think as long as people are paying $1 billion per gigawatt to develop these wind farms, that is not exactly support of the narrative that there'll be a two-way CFD anytime soon. We also have this issue of one of the parties in government being vehemently opposed to the introduction of two-way CFDs. So I think any introduction of the two-way CFD, just sort of by raw politics, just moved out further into the future after what we saw over the last couple of weeks. until there's a sort of more obvious demonstration that some of these projects might need support. Now, the further we move out into the duck's beak, the Entenschnabel, and the more we know about whether there's a split of the bidding zone, et cetera, and power prices might be coming down. If there's a combination of some of these events that make bidders less willing to pay lease fees, the more likely it is that we'll see this discussion return soon. I mean, together with co-authors, I'm on the record saying there are various good reasons for why it would be worth having two-way CFDs, and essentially two-way CFD auctions can also make the money that people are willing to pay in lease fees for the government by asking people to pay two-way CFDs that in expectation pay back to the government rather than support. So I think it's a debate that's worth having eventually, but I don't think it's a debate that's immediate.
Thank you, Dominik. I will stick a little bit with this question, maybe adding another aspect to it, because this question is raising the issue of the realization rate of the projects, which is widely discussed throughout the industry, of course. And here, Breta Zuber is asking, how big are the risks comparing the different projects that the auction projects will not be developed and will be handed back? And then she's asking, and this maybe does not fall so much in your area of competence, but in ours, is this risk assessed by the BMWK and accepted as a political decision? You raised this issue also in your presentation. You were giving some recommendations on a system where you can reach out the projects which were not realized, if I recall it correctly.
Indeed. So on this question of how big are the risks and comparing across the different projects, I mean, the more you paid in bid component, the more marginal your project is going to be in profitability. I think that's a sort of relatively straightforward issue here, abstracting from some of the things like wind yield, etc. But for any given project, the more was paid in bid component, the more marginal the project is going to be. I mean, all of these projects were bid for by professional investors. All of these projects were bid for in a dynamic auction. So these are projects where there was another professional investor willing to pay just marginally less. None of these are cowboy projects, but I mean, all of them are susceptible to adverse macro developments. That's what I set out, and that's why I think BMWK should be prepared. And yes, Manuel, as you mentioned, I can't speak for BMWK. I don't know what they're doing internally. And I'm sure there'll be events where they're at and they can brief you on more what they're doing in that space.
Thank you very much, Dominik. Next question, and I would like to pass to the next issue. Maybe we can move to the industrial policies, because also a couple of questions. We received some couple of questions concerning this issue. The question from Mr. Weber is, how big is the chance under Germany's negative bidding rules that still a European added value and supply chain can grow sufficiently to deliver mostly fully all the offshore wind expansions which are needed for the EU goals? And then he raises the aspect of the anti-dumping fences. He asks, even if anti-dumping fences already would exist at the moment of the FIDs. Of course, this last question is a little bit speculative, but if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on this question concerning industrial policies.
Sure. As I mentioned, the way the German bidding setup is as it is, with uncapped negative bidding and the high optionality value. That does create pressure on the supply chain, especially because of the uncertainty of whether you have a 2 gigawatt option or whether you have a 2 gigawatt project that I'll supply, which is very different for whether I can back it up with the investments needed in terms of the national or European supply chain. I mean, what we're hearing and what some of the successful bidders in this latest round of auctions have been very vocal about is they want to buy European. Obviously, another thing we're hearing is there are lots and lots of constraints in the European supply chain. So when it comes to, is the European supply chain there or is it not? And do I use Chinese components to realize my project at all? I mean, I'm guessing most people would rather use Asian components than abandon a project. Is there more that policymakers could do to support the European supply chain? Very much so. I mean, the German system is very good at generating pledged money. Use some of that pledged money to support the supply chain. You create a virtuous circle. Have a look at the Brits. They are creating a system which is called the Sustainable Industry Reward, where they're having a pre-auction before the CFD auction from next year onwards. And we did some work with DESNZ in the UK, identifying what might be relevant elements of the supply chain that offshore wind farms could support, that the auction design there could support. And essentially what it does is you have an auction with a dedicated pot of money where DESNZ calls for certain improvements. So, sorry, DESNZ is the energy ministry in the UK. It calls for certain improvements in sustainability, in local production, short supply chains, and then offers a financial reward for those that improve short supply chain and sustainability if they pledge to use these components in their CFD bids in the subsequent auction. The idea there is that by having a double auction, you get the desired green solutions at the lowest price because you ask different wind farm operators to bring in their ideas and the most cost-effective ones are being chosen. And then because you're getting support for your green elements that you bring into the CFD auction in the second stage, you're not disadvantaged compared to someone that is not bringing in the green components. That's the idea behind the Sustainable Industry Reward in the UK. I think it's a very smart system that is worth sort of exploring more across Europe. The acid test on how well it works will be AR7, which is scheduled for next year. And then there may be some learning from it. But I think that, plus the use of auction proceeds to strengthen the supply chain based in the existing scheme, are two very important things that help European offshore wind farm operators use local components wherever possible.
Thank you, Dominik. I will now move on to the next issue. And this is the electricity price debate. And of course, not so much the auctioning design or the tendering design, but the market design. We have a question here coming from Monika Morawiecka from the Regulatory Assistance Project. And she's asking, and I'm particularly interested in this, in your answer as well. How do you see compensating the bidders if indeed the German bidding zone should be split?
I mean, my understanding is that the debate around the bidding zone splits is going to involve transitional payments to generators and users across both zones. So I think that should carry over to offshore wind farm operators in the same way that it carries over to any other generator. I'm sure it still creates a lot of disputes and litigation on the back of any PPAs that are currently being signed if things break. Do all these PPAs contain the right sort of break and renegotiation clauses? I think every time there have been market splits or market merges on the gas side, for example, we've seen renegotiations of long-term gas supply and gas storage contracts that have taken far longer to resolve than one might think initially. So I think in general, this is being looked at. Is it going to be painless and easy? No.
Thank you, Dominik. I will now ask you one more question concerning the tendering which have just taken place. And before I would like to move on to the tendering which is going to take place in August. And maybe one last question concerning this complex, let's say. Here's a question coming from Alexander Jung. And it's also a little bit focusing on some of the issues or some of the remarks you were mentioning in your presentation. He asks, do you see a risk that projects are rather realized in other countries than in Germany because other geographies provide cheaper sites?
So I think, big question. The fact that there were lots of people in this German auction and they were willing to bid at various levels, suggests people are interested in bidding in Germany, are interested in developing in Germany, and the price of the German sites to a large extent reflects the fundamental value of the German market that you're supporting. And that you're supplying into. As I mentioned, sites in Estonia may not cost very much, but perspective of developing them is a very different one. Do I see a risk that the German project is more likely to be abandoned than a project elsewhere? Yes, because the issue there, it comes back to it is relatively cheap to abandon it. And because of the very large amounts of negative bidding, it will certainly be sort of marginal in terms of the business plan calculation. Obviously, that's not to say if we were to switch to something like, say, the Dutch system, where you don't have the same prices, but you're being asked to pilot all sorts of experimental kit as part of your bid, we would completely remove any risk of projects being abandoned. I mean, if it turns out floating solar doesn't work, and you've committed to building a 50 megawatt floating solar farm, you may have sunk a perfectly valid offshore wind farm by adding the requirement that you also have to build a floating solar farm that you may not be very interested in building, but that you were strong-armed into doing so.
Thank you. And thanks to the audience also for the questions which we receive now. I have to apologize because we cannot raise all the questions which we receive now, but we try our best. Let's go ahead. Let's look ahead now and move to the tenders, which will be decided now in August. The tenders for the centrally pre-investigated sites. What do you think? Are the results from last week already an indicator for the tenders for pre-examined areas in August? What can we deduce from the last tenders for the next tenders?
Well, I think they are a fundamentally important point to take into account. It's the same regime. A lot of the things it's the same regime, as in it's the same power market that you're feeding into. You're building a wind farm in German waters with largely the same sort of regulatory regime going around it. You have to jump through a few different hoops to get to that point, but the results plus the indication of how many people bid and how they bid provide some indications of what the market thinks these sites are worth. Obviously, when you get to fine-tuning your bid, you need to look at where are these sites different, that may be synergies with sites you've got in the area, clearly that's full load hours. Like all of these things you work through the bid model. And then you come to probably the hardest part of preparing for the August questions, which is you'll have figured out what the site is worth to you. And obviously you can go and sort of bid your full valuation. And then you may win a site that sort of in average case generates almost sort of zero positive economic value because you've maxed out what you think you can bid. And if things go badly, you end up being on the wrong side of the optionality. Although, of course, the penalty in the August auctions is higher, it's double the penalty. So there'll be a bit less optionality involved there, which is another one.
Thank you, Dominik. And now one very difficult question, as it seems to be. And I read the question out loud and you can think about your possible answer. Do you see any problems with the quantitative auction criteria within the Windseegesetz? Should qualitative criteria be given greater consideration? For instance, binding pro rata electricity purchase by industrial consumers, binding long-term electricity purchase by industrial consumers, or supply share of local business areas for decarbonization. Also, these issues are widely discussed throughout the industry. And of course, we are very much interested in your thoughts about it.
Right. I think first of all, I need to refer back to my bike shop example. Obviously, this is auction design, so you need to decide what do you want to achieve. I have a feeling of where this question is coming from. This question essentially asks for how can you make use, what auction design be very good to support German industry and like offtake from German industry, and what would be good for local businesses supporting the wind farm. So both the suppliers and the offtakers of the wind farm. If that's your aim, that's a different bike that you're buying relative to the bike that we're currently selling. So in that case, I think what we need is we need offtake quotas. Whether they're very effective, I'm a bit skeptical about for two reasons. One is, do they work to differentiate between bidders? I mean, if you want the energy purchasing departments of the big chemical companies, the big steel companies, you're going to find their phone number if you're a developer in Germany. So think essentially, if you know someone needs to decarbonize a steel plant, probably any bidder is going to say, hey, look, we've spoken to steelmaker XYZ. They're going to buy all our power. How do you differentiate between these offers? And I mean, the steelmaker has every incentive to say, look, I'm going to buy from whoever won. I want clean power. And you'll probably give exactly the same terms. On the sort of how do I get local businesses into and decarbonization in, I think I'll refer back to my answer on the UK scheme. I think that's probably the most effective way of going about that.
Thank you. Last question for today. As you probably know, or many of you know, our association is advocating for the reduction of the size of the areas tendered out. Netherlands is also thinking about reducing the size of the sites, as we have heard of, we have learned from our colleagues. Our question to you, of course, is what do you think? Is this a feasible and recommendable option for Germany as well?
I mean, I guess the fact that sort of various countries are looking at comes from a number of palpable obstacles that we have seen, which is some bidders have struggled to put up the bid bonds and to put up the essentially the pre-work for a 2 gigawatt site. And in the Netherlands, we've seen that the big 2 gigawatt sites have seen markedly lower interest than the sites that we saw tendered earlier, which were 700 megawatt sites. Is this the panacea? Does it solve all? I mean, I guess if your aim is more people should be able to buy these sites, making the site smaller brings in more people into the initial competition. Does it necessarily make the sites cheaper? Not necessarily so. I mean, more bidders. To displace someone who won a site today at $1 billion, you'd still have to be able to bid more than $1 billion. And if it turns out that under the existing scheme, the bidders most capable of developing these sites are big oil and gas majors and big established utilities, then they may just win 2 sites and combine them afterwards. So in some ways, splitting the sites down allows you to offer more sites, to potentially trial the switching among sites again in the dynamic bidding. It increases the number of bidders that can start. Whether it will change the result on its own, I think remains to be proven.
Yeah, thank you, Dominik, for the lecture and for answering all the questions. You did a great job. We tell you this. Yeah, the time is nearly up now. There are still a lot of questions as far as I could see. And if you want to, please feel free to ask them at info@bwo-offshorewind.de. We will try to collect the questions and hand them over to Dominik. So you have a good job for the
I'll try and answer that.
as you can imagine. For us as BWO, it's clear that there is still, how to say, a big optimization needed in the tender design, because we want to ensure the following goals. First thing is I want to mention is we want to preserve the diversity of actors also in the long term. It was also a topic in today's lecture. We want to ensure a high probability of realization, which goes hand in hand with the third point, ensuring the investment security and de-risking of projects. And last but not least, we want to strengthen the value chain in Europe and the innovative strength of the industry. Therefore, we believe that the following measures are suitable. First of all, I want to point out that ensuring the stakeholder diversity is fundamental for achieving our goals. Measures for this could include, for example, the rule 1 bid, 1 area per bidder, and limiting the size of the sites tendered out to 1 to 1.5 gigawatt. Also, we want to limit the pressure of the uncapped financial bid values on manufacturers, suppliers, and infrastructures. The income from the auctions, you mentioned it already, must be used as a transformation component to strengthen the industrial value chain and especially the infrastructure, such as ports, for example, in Germany. Yes, and then last but not least, we need to start a broad political discussion now in Germany with the BWK. We need to discuss how to how to develop the market design and how to develop the tender design in Germany. We must not wait for the implementation for the European implementing act on the Net Zero Industry Act. I would like to thank all of today's listeners, and especially to our guest Dominik again from NERA. Dear audience, you don't have to be too sad. If you want to know more about the work at BWO, please feel free to write us, and even better, you can become a member if you want to. So just contact us. Something else tells me that we will meet soon again. And I really have an idea. I already have an idea what we can talk about. So stay tuned.